Rowan Hale was a man who loved the sea and the quiet it kept. He had sailed long enough to know when the weather would turn. He knew the voices that rose in a deck at night. He knew fear when it smelled like wet wool and old coal. He was captain of the Northwind, a stout ship worn bright with salt, with a crew that trusted routine. They were headed north, where the world thinned and light grew thin with it. They had agreed to keep moving, to ride the drift and wait for open water. But Rowan would not move. He ordered the anchor down in the middle of the cold plain. He said nothing of his reason. The men argued. They warned him that ice could gather fast, that the hull might freeze and crack, that the sea could claim them like one of its old debts. He nodded. He kept the chart folded. He walked the rail at dawn, hands clasped behind his back, looking past the rim of the world. There was a calm about him that felt like waiting, a peace that looked like surrender. Days went by. The light was flat. The ship creaked in gentle protest. Rations grew small, the men grew small too, their talk narrowing to the same few fears. The cabin doors rattled with every breath of wind. The first to speak of something else was Thomas Greer, the second mate. He came to the mess in the gray hour, voice thin like a bone. He said he had seen a woman one night. Not quite a woman and not quite a trick. She had stood at the rail, pale as the ice, and had looked at him as if she knew him. They laughed first. They blamed spirits and cold. They blamed hunger and idle hours. Thomas felt the laughter like frost. He kept telling the shape of what he had seen. A few nights later, Amos Pike, a younger hand, stopped shaving and said he had seen the same thing. He spoke of a soft outline moving around the bows, a light that had no source. The men started to watch. Eyes traveled the edge of the ship more often. They said the stories together now, and in the telling the stories grew. Even the doctor, Helena Sorrell, who held men together with bandage and calm, confessed she had heard a cry, a small sound, far off, like someone calling for something they could not say. She kept her hand on a jar as she described it. Her face did not look like a soldier shrugging off fear. She looked like a woman who had been woken. The sense of being watched took root. It did not belong to one man or to superstition alone. It braided into the cold air. At night, the deck smelled faintly of flowers, and there were no flowers to be had. Footsteps seemed to come closer when the watch was thin. The men slept less. They took to standing in twos. Rowan walked as always, silent and steady. He listened more often than he spoke. Once, Greer caught him tracing the pattern of a bruise on the map with his thumb, as if following a letter he would not read aloud. Amos swore one afternoon that Rowan stood at the bow with his hands open, looking as if he would take something from the air. The crew began to think of old tales. They spoke in low voices of beckoning ghosts and lost promises. They blamed the long sky. They blamed the captain at the same time, because he had anchored them, because he had stayed where the sea wanted them moving. But Rowan paid no heed to being blamed. On a night when the sky held no stars, Rowan left the ship. No one saw the door open. No one pretended to see. A thin wind borrowed its way across the ice. A few men on watch noticed the captain was gone and called out. They found only the sound of their own voices. They lit lamps and went out onto the white plain. They crossed the sea like men crossing a blank page. The ice was slick and small cracks sang underfoot. They called his name until their throats were raw. They searched until a hard cold wrapped them and the lamps threw thin ghosts on the snow. They came back empty. The decks were quieter than before. At dawn, there was no sign. They rowed skiffs and beat the ice with poles. They peered into blue crevices and around ridges. Greer cried once, low and broken. Helena held him, though she knew no more than he did. On the third morning, a shape lay on the ice. They found him some way off, pale as bone, shoulders relaxed like a man who had finally let go. There was no blood. There was no mess. He had not been dragged or struck. He lay as if he had simply fallen asleep on a cold bed. His face carried a smile. It was small and bright, like someone who had finally remembered something lovely. His hands were bent forward, fingers curled as if to hold something that was not there. They were stained with cold, but not with struggle. He wore his coat, fastened up to his throat. The watch who lifted him felt the warmth in his skin, and then watched it leave. They brought him back to the ship on a sled. The men moved like people who had been given a small, quiet cruelty and told to keep it. They placed him on the deck under the low roof of the stern. Helena set her instruments and frowned. She examined him with small, careful hands. No mark explained his smile. No wound explained his peace. She lifted his chin and found a quiet in his face that no medicine could find. The crew argued about what had taken him. They argued about ghosts and madness, and the sea claiming a man who wanted to be taken. They looked at his hands, and at the way the fingers had curled, as if around a body that was not there. The men thought at once of things Rowan had not said. They thought of the way he had watched the horizon like a person waiting for a train that never arrived. They remembered the afternoon he had taken a folded letter from his pocket and burned it by the wheel, the edges black and perfume gone with the smoke. They read such moments as if they were the only language left. Some nights after that, the crew said they smelled lavender near the rail. They said faint footsteps walked the deck when no one stood. They said that occasionally, just before dawn, a thin light would pass over the ice like a hand sliding across water. They spoke of Rowan as if he had been taken into a private place. They said he had followed something that called him by a name only he remembered. They said his smile meant he had found what he had been searching for years. The north wind did not long hold to the spot after Rowan's body was laid to rest. The crew raised anchor and let the ship drift with the tides. They kept a small vigil for his memory. They told the story in low voices, and sometimes they used it to laugh the ache from their chests. But each of them, in the dark watches, would look at the rail and brace for a face they could not see. They would imagine his hands closing around empty air, feeling as if the touch might yet return. In the end, that was the cruelest thing to hold. A man had gone out into the dark and come back smiling. He had, the men said, embraced whatever it was that waited beyond the ice. They were left to carry a small truth, cold and simple. Rowan Hale had been a captain. He had been a man who chose the stillness. He had gone to meet a presence that only he could answer. And he had crossed the white plain with a smile on his face, fingers bent as if holding nothing, and yet holding everything he had been missing.
Adrian was an artist. Such things happened to artists. He was young, handsome, and restless. He had no parents. His uncle Anton raised him in a tidy house. Ava, his cousin, grew up there too. She loved him. He swore he loved her back. When he returned from study in Firenze, he was bright with plans. They walked the river paths. They watched light fall on the water. They kept the promise from Anton. He wanted Ava wed to someone with money, so they were secretly betrothed. He took his mother's ring out. It was a heavy gold serpent. He slid it on Ava's third finger. It fit like a secret. He said strange things in the dusk. "If you die," he joked once, "I will find you beyond the grave." Ava answered softly. She believed the peaceful dead stayed at peace. She did not think the living could call them back. Time passed. Adrian left on a commission. At first the letters came. They were full of sketches and small jokes. Then they came less. Then they stopped. Ava went to the tiny post office again and again. She waited in the morning cold. She forced herself to hope. Weeks wore at her. Hope turned raw and thin. Anton had little patience left. A wealthy man asked for Ava's hand. The wedding was fixed for June 15th. The date became a fault line in her days. On the 14th, she walked to the bridge where they had promised. She had one last night that belonged only to her. Adrian had read her final, desperate letter. He had put it aside and waited. A model in Fiorenza had taken his eye. His fancy had shifted. He planned to arrive after the wedding to salute the bride, so he delayed. On a gray morning, he came back to the town he had left. He drifted by the river with his dog, Bruno. He carried his sketchbook. Here and there he stopped to draw the willows and the bank. Two fishermen rested on a low rise. Between them lay a bundle on a rough bier. He paid the men and drew the sailcloth aside. Water had laid its pale hand across hair and cheek. It was Ava. Her hair clung like riverweed. Her hands lay folded. On the ring finger, the serpent glinted. Something in him shut like a door. He walked away at once. He fled because flight was easiest. He took a diligence and rode until the town was small in the rear window. On the road, a fever took him. He lay in a stranger's inn for 6 weeks. When he woke, he kept moving. He laughed too loud. He tried to be free. But grief moves like a patient shadow. One night he stood before a tall church. The bells had just died. Moonlight lay like silver on the square. His dog was at his heel. He felt hands close about his neck. They were cold. They were damp as river cloth. There was no one to be seen, only his shadow and the dog's on the stones. He seized the air and found long, slim fingers. The serpent ring pressed into his palm. He knew it by touch. Bruno howled and sprang back. The grasp vanished like mist. Adrian tried to stitch his life into ordinary things. He shared runes with other students. He kept his days full of copying pictures. Still, the touch would come. Sometimes in an empty inn-room, sometimes on a lonely road. He stopped sleeping in a bed alone. Seasons turned. His coins thinned. He walked toward a city that held a great carnival. He thought a crowd would drown a ghost. He bought a ticket to the opera. He hid a fraying coat under a cheap domino. Inside the house, the air was heavy with perfume and song. A bright-eyed dancer leaned on his arm and smiled. He made small talk. He could not swallow the wine. The lights burned lower. The crowd thinned. Morning crept in, pale and patient. The woman on his arm became a blank. Faces around him slid into the shape of loss. Cold fingers found him in the empty hall. This time the hands would not be shaken away. He did not fight. He let the embrace pull him into a slow, endless turn. His feet moved as if on memory. His breath found a steady pain. When the keepers checked the house in the hush, they found a dog howling by the steps. They found a thin student collapsed near the main door. They said it was hunger. They said it was exhaustion. They said the breaking of a blood vessel. They wrapped him and carried him away like a small thing. In the river, the serpent gleamed still on a pale finger. The town kept its small days. The bridge remembered. The water kept giving up its quiet secret. The cold embrace that had haunted him ended with his fall. 2 graves closed in the ordinary world. Only the river kept the truth, and the ring shone like a last, stubborn promise.
Everything Thomas told afterwards sounded too strange to be true. People asked for rational causes. They said he must have been dreaming. He never thought so. He never stopped knowing what he had seen. Thomas and Marianne had little money. He painted, she wrote. They married and left the town, looking for a cheap cottage. They wanted quiet, good light, and a cheap garden. They found a long, low house on the hill above the marshes. It had old stonework at one end. Round that stone the cottage had grown, room by room. It was charming and nearly falling to pieces. They took it and paid what they could. They hired an old woman named Mrs. Hargreaves. She moved with the slow dignity of someone born to the land. She knew the names of the hedges and the old stories. She told them about smugglers and lonely things at night. She told them most of all about the 2 marble effigies in the church. She called them the figures that were drawn man-size in marble. Her voice made the words sound alive. Marianne laughed at first, but she liked the stories. They used them in little magazine pieces. That earned a guinea now and then. So the house was bright with books and paint. They lived simply and happily for 3 months. On an October afternoon, Mrs. Hargreaves came to Thomas in his painting room. She said she would leave at the end of the month. Her niece was ill, she said. Thomas thought it a silly reason. He asked her to stay. She would not. Then, lowering her voice, she told him the other reason. She spoke of the church effigies. She said that on All Saints' Eve, the marble figures sat up. She said they walked down the aisle. She said they walked over the graves and along the bier balk. She said that sometimes there were marks of their feet in the morning. Mrs. Hargreaves warned them to cross themselves and to lock the doors. Thomas smiled then. He thought it folk myth. He did not tell Marianne everything. He painted Marianne instead. She sat by the lattice window as his model. He loved the way the late sun touched her hair. Mrs. Hargreaves went on Thursday. Marianne learned cooking quickly. They laughed about the knives and the washing up. The little household did not fall apart. On Friday, the day was bright, and the sky was close and strange. They walked the hedgerows and watched the marsh mist curling up. That evening, Marianne said she felt uneasy. She had a queer shiver, twice. She spoke of presentiments. Thomas laughed it away. They played the new piano pieces until late. At 10:30, Thomas said he would take a pipe outside. Marianne begged him not to stay long. He kissed her and left, the front door unlatched. The night was restless. Big clouds raced and the moon swam in and out. A thin gray light lay over the fields. Thomas could not go straight to bed. He walked to the church on the hill. He liked the old place. It made him think of being small and safe. The path ran through a wood and over the bier balk. The church had deep Norman arches. In the chancel lay 2 gray marble knights on slabs. Villagers called them wicked men long dead. They had been carved to pray forever. As Thomas reached the porch, the church door was open. He remembered Mrs. Hargreaves' story with a sudden chill. He should have laughed, he thought, but he went in. He wanted to see the figures and prove how silly the fear was. He walked up the aisle. The church seemed larger that night. Moonlight moved across the flags. Then he stopped. The slabs were bare. Where the marble figures had lain, there was only stone. A white emptiness showed under the window arch. He felt a cold rise in him. A torch he had made of paper and his pipe clattered from his hands.
He ran out, stumbling over the graves. Across the field, a dark shape sprang out of the turf. It gripped his arm. It was Dr. O'Neill returning from a patient. "Have you lost your wits?" the doctor asked, and shook him. Thomas told him the slabs were empty. They went back together. The doctor laughed at first, then struck a match. There on the slabs lay the two gray men again. Thomas felt foolish and ashamed. Then Dr. O'Neill bent close and said, quiet and puzzled, "Look here, one of the hands is broken." They walked home slowly, talking over explanations. By the time they reached the garden, the parlor glowed with candlelight. The door stood open and candles burned in many places. Mary Ann's chair was empty. Her handkerchief lay on the floor. The window was thrown wide to the autumn air. Then Thomas saw her in the window recess. She had fallen back. Her body lay half on the small table and half on the window seat. Her hair hung loose on the carpet. Her eyes were wide and fixed. Her lips were drawn back in a last small breath. Dr. O'Neill moved forward. Thomas pushed him aside. He caught his wife in his arms. He called to her as one calls to a child who had fallen. He kissed her and whispered. He did not believe at first. Her hands were clenched. One held something small, hard, and cold. When he prized her fingers open, he saw gray stone in her palm. It was a small marble finger. Not a whole hand, just a finger, smoothed and weathered like old stone. For a moment, Thomas only stared. Then the shock of it broke him. He felt the ground tilt. All the shreds of sense he had left fled him. He thought of the church and the bare slabs and the broken hand. He thought of Mrs. Hargreaves and her hushed voice and the beer balk. He thought of the long, slow clouds and the thin gray light over the marshes. He thought of the marble men that might rise and walk again. He thought of the small stone finger in Mary Ann's hand. After that, people offered reasons. They said his fear had made him see things. They said he had been overworked or that he had taken to drink. Some said Mary Ann had died of a sudden fit. None of that fixed the shape of that night. None explained how a piece of marble came into a living hand. Thomas could not make sense of it. He only knew the image that would never leave him. Mary Ann dead, a gray stone finger clutched in her fist, and the church slabs once more lying smooth and cold beneath the moon.